Hey guys, tonight we're heading to ancient Rome, a civilization famous for roads, laws, aqueducts, and making sure your wedding night involved shouting relatives, fake kidnapping, and absolutely no privacy whatsoever. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In ancient Rome, marriage was not a love story. It was not a whirlwind romance, not a dramatic confession in the rain, and certainly not two people locking eyes across a forum and realizing they were soulmates. Roman marriage was a transaction, a very serious transaction, with witnesses and expectations, and zero interest in your feelings. To Romans, love was unreliable. Love made people impulsive. Love caused bad decisions, poetry, and occasionally civil wars. None of these were desirable outcomes. What Romans trusted instead were contracts, traditions, and ancestors who had been doing things the same way for centuries and were absolutely not open to feedback. Marriage existed to connect families, secure property, produce legitimate heirs, and keep inheritance disputes from turning into murder. Or worse, lawsuits. Emotional fulfillment ranked somewhere below owning a decent toga on the priority list. If affection happened later, wonderful. If not, well, that is what mistresses were for. Efficient system, morally questionable, very Roman. This is why the wedding night mattered so much. Not because it was romantic, but because it was evidence. Evidence that the bride had officially left one household and entered another. Evidence that the marriage contract had moved from theoretical to painfully real. Evidence that future children would not require awkward explanations. Romans hated ambiguity. They hated uncertainty. They especially hated situations where someone could later say, "Well, actually, the marriage was never fully completed." That kind of sentence caused chaos, inheritance problems, and extremely long arguments involving lawyers who charged by the hour. Metaphorically, of course, because timekeeping was still a mess. So the wedding night was designed to eliminate doubt. It was loud, it was public, it was witnessed by relatives, neighbours, household gods, and probably at least one uncle who refused to leave. Romance did not enter the room. Tradition did, loudly, and sat down without asking. The bride was not marrying for herself. She was marrying for her family's future. The groom was not gaining a partner. He was gaining responsibility, expectations, and a mother who would absolutely judge his performance as a husband within the week. To modern audiences, this feels cold, uncomfortable, slightly horrifying. But to Romans, it was stability. A society obsessed with order could not afford emotional spontaneity. Marriage had to be clear, unquestionable, and impossible to undo without serious consequences. Love could come later. First came duty. And duty, in ancient Rome, did not care how you felt about it. One of the strangest rules of an ancient Roman wedding was that the bride was required to act as though the entire situation was happening against her will, even if she liked the groom, even if she was excited, even if she had spent weeks preparing for this moment. None of that mattered. On the wedding night, enthusiasm was suspicious. Resistance was tradition. Roman society believed that a respectable bride did not eagerly leave her family home. Doing so would suggest impatience, desire, or, worst of all, personal agency. Instead, the bride was expected to cry, protest, and cling to her mother as if she were being dragged away by fate itself, rather than escorted by relatives she had known her entire life. This performance was not optional. A bride who walked calmly toward her new home risked being judged as shameless. A bride who smiled too much invited gossip. The correct emotional setting was dramatic reluctance mixed with theatrical despair. Think less joyful newlywed and more tragic heroine being written out of her own childhood. Guests fully understood this was an act. No one was fooled. Everyone played along anyway, because Roman tradition was not about truth, it was about continuity. This ritual reenacted the ancient belief that marriage originated in abduction. By pretending to resist, The bride symbolically honoured her ancestors, reassured her family's honour, and avoided uncomfortable whispers later. The irony, of course, is that the bride's lack of consent was carefully choreographed. She was expected to resist, but not too much. Cry, but not hysterically. Struggle, but never actually escape. Roman weddings were emotional theatre with extremely strict blocking. Meanwhile, the groom stood nearby, pretending not to notice, as if he were not about to take responsibility for this entire situation. His job was to look serious, dignified, and slightly burdened. The expression of a man thinking, "Well, this is my life now. This ritual served a clear purpose." It publicly marked the bride's separation from her childhood household. Once she was pulled away, there was no ambiguity, no soft transition, no lingering attachments. The old life ended dramatically, in front of witnesses, so the new one could begin without question. To modern eyes, this feels unsettling. But to Romans, it was reassuring. A woman who appeared reluctant was respectable. A marriage that looked difficult was legitimate. In ancient Rome, desire was suspicious. Resistance was respectable. And pretending you did not want something was the first step toward being considered worthy of it. Once the bride had demonstrated sufficient reluctance, crying, clinging, and generally performing emotional resistance at an acceptable Roman level, it was time for the wedding night to truly begin. And by begin, ancient Rome meant a ritual kidnapping conducted in front of friends, family, neighbours, and anyone else who happened to be nearby and enjoying the chaos. The bride was physically pulled away from her mother's arms, not violently, not cruelly, but firmly and dramatically. The goal was symbolism, not injury. This moment marked the official severing of her ties to her childhood household. From this point on, she no longer belonged to her father's family. She now belonged to her husband's household, its gods, and its expectations. Romance was still nowhere in sight. This was not a surprise. Everyone knew it was coming. The bride knew, the groom knew, the guests knew, and yet the ritual required commitment. You could not half-kidnap a bride. That would look unserious. Roman tradition demanded full participation, preferably with enough noise to ensure nearby ancestors were fully aware that a marriage was happening. Guests often cheered during this moment, not out of cruelty, but because cheering was part of the performance. The louder the crowd, the more legitimate the marriage appeared. Silence suggested doubt. Doubt was dangerous. Doubt led to inheritance disputes, and Romans absolutely did not want to deal with that later. The bride's apparent distress served a social purpose. It reassured everyone watching that she had not rushed into marriage out of desire or impatience. She was leaving reluctantly, as a respectable woman should. At the same time, it reassured the groom's family that she was being properly transferred, not casually wandering into their household on her own terms. From a modern perspective, this ritual feels deeply uncomfortable. Watching someone be symbolically dragged away from their home triggers every instinct we have to intervene. But to Romans, this was clarity. This was closure. This was a clean break performed loudly enough that no one could pretend it did not happen. Once the bride was removed, there was no turning back. No private second thoughts. No quiet reconsideration. The ritual kidnapping made the transition final. In ancient Rome, marriage did not begin with consent whispered in private. It began with a public declaration that childhood was over, and nothing declared that more clearly than being carried away while everyone watched. Once the bride had been successfully removed from her family, loudly, publicly, and with appropriate symbolic distress, the wedding night shifted into its next phase, the torchlit procession. This was not a gentle walk. This was not a quiet escort. This was a roaming, shouting, fire-filled parade, designed to make absolutely sure that everyone within earshot knew a marriage had just occurred. The procession moved through the streets at night, led by friends and relatives carrying torches. Fire mattered here. Fire scared away evil spirits, illuminated the bride's transition, and added a dramatic flair that said, "Something irreversible is happening, and we brought flames to prove it." Romans loved symbolism, but they loved spectacle even more. As the group marched, guests shouted jokes, loud ones, obscene ones, jokes so crude that Roman writers later refused to record them, which tells you everything you need to know. This was not poor manners. This was protection. Romans believed laughter and vulgar language confused jealous spirits who might otherwise interfere with fertility or marital success. If an evil force was listening, the idea was to overwhelm it with nonsense until it gave up. This meant the bride's wedding night began with her being escorted through the city, while her relatives yelled things that absolutely should not be repeated in polite company. It was chaotic. It was uncomfortable. It was mandatory. And privacy? Completely absent. Neighbours leaned out of windows. Children followed along. Strangers joined the noise. The louder the procession, the more legitimate the marriage felt. A quiet wedding night suggested something had gone wrong. Romans trusted volume more than subtlety. The groom walked near the bride, maintaining a respectable distance and an expression that suggested dignity rather than panic. His role was to look solemn and responsible, as if he were not currently being escorted home by a crowd chanting jokes about his future performance as a husband. The procession ended at the groom's house, where the torches cast dramatic shadows over the doorway. This moment marked the bride's official arrival into a new life. From this point forward, she belonged to this household, its traditions, and its gods. To modern eyes, this looks like chaos. But to Romans, it was order, loud order, firelit order. In ancient Rome, marriage was not something you slipped into quietly. It was announced. It was shouted. And it arrived at your door accompanied by flames, laughter, and zero concern for your nerves. By the time the torchlit procession reached the groom's house, Roman guests were just getting warmed up, literally and emotionally. This was not the moment for quiet reflection or respectful silence. This was the moment for obscene wedding songs delivered at full volume, with enthusiasm, creativity, and absolutely no shame. These songs were not optional. They were an expected and essential part of the wedding night. Romans believed that loud, vulgar humour protected the couple from bad luck, jealousy, and supernatural interference. Evil spirits, apparently, were easily offended and easily confused. If you shouted enough inappropriate jokes, they would simply leave out of discomfort. Honestly, relatable. The content of these songs was deliberately crude. Guests mocked the groom's masculinity, made explicit jokes about the bride and groom's future intimacy, and generally said things that would get you banned from modern family gatherings for life. But in Rome, this was not rudeness. This was ritual protection wrapped in peer pressure. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to endure this with modesty. She did not laugh loudly. She did not respond. She certainly did not tell anyone to stop. A respectable Roman bride absorbed the embarrassment quietly, staring at the floor while her relatives loudly discussed her wedding night, like it was a public performance review. The groom was in a similar position. He was mocked openly, teased mercilessly, and reminded that expectations were high. These songs served a social function. They reinforced community norms, publicly acknowledged the sexual side of marriage, and ensured that everyone understood what the marriage was for. Romance was still nowhere on the schedule, and the audience was large. Neighbours listened. Passers-by stopped. Children absolutely heard things they should not have, but would later pretend not to remember. Privacy was not part of the Roman wedding night. It was a communal event with commentary. Eventually, after sufficient noise had been made and enough spirits had been offended into retreat, the guests moved on to the next stage of the ritual. But the songs mattered. They marked the transition from public ceremony to private obligation. They were the last loud reminder that marriage was not just between two people, but between families, ancestors, and society itself. To modern ears, this feels mortifying. To Romans, it was reassuring. A wedding night without obscene songs would have felt incomplete, dangerous, and suspiciously quiet. In ancient Rome, love might have been private. But marriage? Marriage was announced with jokes so loud even the gods could hear them. After the shouting, the singing, and the public humiliation disguised as tradition, the wedding party finally reached the most deceptively dangerous object of the night: the doorway. To modern people, a doorway is just a rectangle you walk through while checking your phone. To the Romans, It was a supernatural obstacle course filled with bad omens, lurking spirits, and the very real possibility of ruining your marriage by tripping. Tripping over the threshold was considered disastrous. It suggested hesitation, misfortune, or divine disapproval. In other words, it was the kind of small accident that could haunt you for the rest of your married life, at least according to Roman logic. And Roman logic did not care whether the floor was uneven or the bride was exhausted from being dragged through the streets. So the solution was simple: do not let the bride walk inside at all. Instead, the groom lifted her and carried her over the threshold. This had nothing to do with romance. No sweeping gestures, no tender symbolism. This was a practical maneuver designed to keep the gods calm and the neighbours satisfied. If the bride never touched the threshold, she could not offend it. Problem solved. This action also quietly reinforced another Roman belief. The bride did not enter her new home by her own choice. She was brought in, transferred, installed. Like a very important household object with opinions, the symbolism was clear and not subtle. The guests watched closely. This was not a moment to mess up. Dropping the bride would have been a disaster of mythic proportions. Slipping would have been discussed for years. Someone absolutely would have blamed it for later marital problems. Oh, the arguments. Of course they argue. Remember the doorway. Once inside, the bride was officially part of the household. The threshold marked the boundary between her old life and her new one. She crossed it once, carried, and that was it. No do-overs, no returns, no refunds. To modern eyes, this feels uncomfortable. To Romans, it was sensible. Doorways were liminal spaces, and liminal spaces were dangerous. Better to handle them carefully, preferably with witnesses and fire nearby. In ancient Rome, you did not casually enter your marriage. You were carried into it, because even a single misstep could offend fate, and fate, according to the Romans, held grudges. Once the bride had been safely carried over the threshold, without tripping, dropping, or offending any invisible forces, attention shifted to the most important object in the house: the bed. This was not just furniture. This was a ceremonial zone, a sacred installation, a heavily supervised piece of household infrastructure upon which the future of the family depended. The Roman marriage bed was prepared in advance with almost paranoid care. Flowers were arranged around it. Woolen bands were tied nearby. Amulets and charms were placed discreetly within reach. None of this was for aesthetics. Romans were not decorating, they were defending. Fertility, prosperity, and domestic harmony were fragile things, and the bed needed every supernatural advantage it could get. The bed itself symbolized continuity. This was where legitimate heirs were expected to be produced, preferably without complications, divine displeasure, or awkward legal disputes later. Everything about the bed communicated seriousness. This was not a place for romance. This was a workplace. The bride was guided toward it carefully, often by female relatives who had opinions and were not shy about sharing them. These women adjusted clothing, offered instructions, and generally ensured that tradition was being followed correctly. The bride did not collapse onto the bed in exhaustion. That would have looked careless. She was placed, positioned, and prepared like someone about to participate in a ritual rather than a private moment. Meanwhile, the groom entered with the confidence expected of a Roman man, regardless of whether that confidence was earned. Roman society assumed he knew what he was doing. This assumption was optimistic at best. But tradition did not allow for hesitation. Hesitation suggested uncertainty. Uncertainty suggested bad omens. Everyone preferred confident ignorance to cautious doubt. The bed was also public in a way modern people would find horrifying. It was discussed openly, joked about earlier, commented on later. It was never just between the couple. It belonged to the household, the family line, and the ancestors watching quietly from wherever Romans believed ancestors watched from. To modern minds, the idea of a sacred, symbol-heavy bed feels intrusive. To Romans, it was reassuring. It meant the marriage was anchored in ritual, protected by tradition, and impossible to misunderstand. In ancient Rome, the wedding bed was not about intimacy. It was about legitimacy, And legitimacy, like everything else in Roman marriage, required witnesses, even when no one was technically in the room. Once the bride was positioned on the sacred bed, surrounded by flowers, wool, expectations, and the collective anxiety of several generations, attention shifted to a very specific piece of clothing: her belt. This was not a fashion accessory. This was a symbolic device loaded with meaning, superstition, and an alarming amount of pressure. The bride wore a woolen belt tied in a special knot associated with strength, fertility, and masculine virtue. The knot itself was often linked to Hercules, a hero famous for power, endurance, and solving problems by applying excessive force. Subtle symbolism was not Rome's strong point. Only the groom was allowed to untie this knot. No assistance, no advice, no second chances. This act symbolized his authority as a husband and his role in continuing the family line. It was less romantic gesture and more ritual confirmation that you are now responsible for everything that follows. This moment mattered. Untying the knot incorrectly, awkwardly, or with visible confusion would not have gone unnoticed, even though technically no one was supposed to be watching. Roman culture had a remarkable ability to know things it was not present for. The knot represented restraint, order, control. Its untying symbolized the official transition from maiden to wife. Once undone, the marriage moved from symbolic to real, from public performance to private obligation. And yet the irony was unavoidable. The groom was expected to perform this task with confidence and authority, regardless of whether he had any experience or understanding of what came next. Roman society assumed competence by default. Reality was expected to catch up later. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to remain passive and modest throughout this moment. She did not assist. She did not comment. She did not guide the process. A respectable bride did not rush what tradition had carefully slowed down. To modern eyes, this feels painfully awkward. A symbolic knot representing cosmic order placed in the hands of two people who barely knew each other, surrounded by a culture that had already discussed their night in graphic detail earlier. Romance was still nowhere to be found. But to Romans, this was clarity. The knot existed to mark a boundary, and its untying crossed it. No confusion, no ambiguity, no emotional interpretation required. In ancient Rome, marriage did not begin with affection. It began with a knot. And once that knot was undone, there was no pretending the ritual was still theoretical. At this point, you might reasonably assume the wedding night finally became private. The door closes, the torches dim, the relatives politely go home and mind their own business. Absolutely not. In ancient Rome, the guests did not leave. They gathered outside the bedroom door like an emotionally invested audience that had paid for front row seats and fully intended to get their money's worth. Silence was suspicious. Silence suggested hesitation. Hesitation suggested bad omens, and bad omens were everyone's problem. So the guests stayed. They sang, they shouted, they laughed, they knocked on the door. Sometimes they demanded noise from inside, just to confirm that the marriage was proceeding according to schedule. This was not considered rude. This was considered supportive. Roman-style support was loud, intrusive, and impossible to ignore. The logic behind this behaviour was deeply Roman. Evil spirits, according to popular belief, preferred quiet, intimate spaces where they could cause trouble unnoticed. A noisy doorway confused them. Laughter drove them away. Public acknowledgement ensured protection. If something important was happening, it needed witnesses, even if those witnesses were technically standing in the hallway making jokes. The couple inside the room was expected to tolerate this without complaint. Asking for privacy would have raised eyebrows. Complaining would have been worse. Privacy implied secrecy, and secrecy implied something was wrong. Roman society trusted noise far more than discretion. The groom, in particular, was under pressure. His relatives, friends, and neighbours were very aware of what was supposed to happen next, and they were not shy about commenting on it. The jokes aimed at him were crude, relentless, and designed to remind him of his responsibilities. Masculinity in Rome was a public performance, even when you were behind a closed door. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to remain quiet, modest, and dignified, despite the fact that her wedding night had turned into a spectator sport with commentary. This contradiction did not bother Romans in the slightest. Tradition rarely concerns itself with comfort. Eventually, the noise faded. Not because the guests felt satisfied, but because they believed their presence had done its job. The spirits had been chased away. The marriage had been publicly acknowledged. The night could proceed. In ancient Rome, the wedding night was never just between two people. It belonged to the family, the household, and a crowd outside the door making sure tradition was being respected. With the door finally closed, and the crowd lingering just long enough to make sure it really was closed, Roman tradition shifted into one of its favourite contradictions. The bride was expected to be modest, passive, and restrained. The groom, meanwhile, was expected to be confident, capable, and completely in control of a situation he had likely never experienced before. This expectation was not negotiable. Roman society assumed male competence by default. Whether the groom was prepared, informed, or emotionally ready did not matter. He was a Roman man. That was considered qualification enough. Hesitation was dangerous. Uncertainty suggested weakness. Weakness was unacceptable, especially on a night that symbolized authority, continuity, and social order. The bride, on the other hand, was expected to demonstrate restraint. She did not lead. She did not speak openly. She did not express fear or excitement. A respectable Roman bride was quiet, composed, and obedient, even as her entire future shifted in a single evening. This imbalance was not accidental. It reinforced Roman ideas about hierarchy within marriage. The wedding night was not about shared discovery. It was about roles being established clearly and immediately. One person acted, the other received. Ambiguity was the enemy. And then there was the awkward reality that Roman tradition carefully ignored. Many brides were very young, and many grooms were not exactly experienced teachers. The expectation of effortless competence collided with human uncertainty in ways Roman culture preferred not to acknowledge. There were no guides, no gentle conversations, no space for mistakes. Tradition assumed everything would simply work itself out, because tradition always assumed it was right. Any discomfort was framed as normal. Any confusion was to be endured quietly. Complaining would have suggested that the ritual itself was flawed, and that was unthinkable. To modern audiences, this feels deeply uncomfortable. The lack of communication, the imbalance of expectations, the silence demanded from one side. All of it highlights how different Roman values were from our own. But to Romans, this was stability. Clear roles meant fewer disputes later. Fewer disputes meant fewer challenges to authority. Marriage was not meant to be emotionally fulfilling. It was meant to function. In ancient Rome, the wedding night was not about mutual understanding. It was about performing your role correctly. And tradition assumed you already knew your lines, whether you did or not. As if the relatives outside the door were not enough pressure, ancient Romans believed the wedding night also had an audience that could not be shooed away: the household gods. These were not distant, abstract deities lounging comfortably on Mount Olympus. These were domestic gods. They lived in the house. They watched everything. And they were very invested in how this marriage turned out. Every Roman home contained a small shrine dedicated to the household spirits, usually located near the hearth. These gods protected the family, oversaw daily life, and took personal interest in major transitions, marriage being one of the biggest. The wedding night was not just a social event, it was a religious milestone. The gods were witnesses whether you liked it or not. This belief added another layer of anxiety to an already uncomfortable situation. The bride and groom were expected to behave properly, respectfully, and in accordance with tradition, because misbehavior was not just embarrassing. It was offensive to divine beings who lived in the same building. The bride's entry into the household marked her formal introduction to these gods. She was no longer protected by her father's spirits. From this night onward, she belonged to a new set of divine supervisors. This was taken very seriously. A marriage that displeased the household gods risked infertility, illness, or general misfortune. the Roman equivalent of leaving a bad review with the universe. To appease these gods, certain rituals were observed, offerings were made, words were spoken, actions followed prescribed patterns. Nothing was left to chance. Roman religion was not about faith, it was about procedure. Do the steps correctly, and the gods would cooperate. Skip one, and enjoy the consequences. The groom also had responsibilities here. As head of the household, he was expected to maintain good relations with the gods. A successful wedding night was seen as evidence that the gods approved of the union. A troubled one invited uncomfortable questions, not just from family, but from fate itself. To modern ears, the idea of divine surveillance feels intrusive. To Romans, it was comforting. The gods provided order. They ensured continuity. They watched the transition from one generation to the next and kept the system intact. In ancient Rome, marriage was never private, not from family, not from society, and certainly not from the gods quietly observing from the corner of the room. In ancient Rome, the wedding night did not quietly end when the sun came up. There was no sleeping in, no lazy morning, no pretending nothing monumental had just happened. Mourning itself was part of the ritual, and it mattered almost as much as the night before. The new bride woke up not as a guest, not as a daughter, but as a full member of her husband's household. This transition had to be visible, deliberate, and properly acknowledged. Romans did not trust subtlety. If something important happened, it needed a ceremony attached to it. One of the bride's first responsibilities was to greet the household gods again, this time not as a visitor, but as their new caretaker. She was now responsible for maintaining domestic harmony, overseeing daily rituals, and ensuring the gods were properly respected. No pressure, just the spiritual well-being of an entire household resting on your shoulders before breakfast. The bride also began performing domestic tasks immediately. This was not punishment, it was symbolism. By engaging in household duties, she demonstrated her new role publicly. Marriage was not complete until society could see that she belonged here, working, managing, and participating in the rhythm of the home. Relatives were often present, watching, observing, occasionally offering advice that was neither requested nor helpful. This was not an intimate mourning. It was an inspection disguised as tradition. Everyone wanted confirmation that the transition had gone smoothly, and that the marriage had been properly established. In some cases, the bride shared a formal morning meal with her husband, reinforcing the idea that they were now a unit. This meal was less about bonding and more about public acknowledgement. Eating together mattered. It showed order. It showed continuity. It showed that the system was still functioning. The groom, meanwhile, stepped fully into his role as household leader. The wedding night marked his assumption of responsibility, not just for a wife, but for future children, property, and divine relationships. Marriage was not a reward, it was an obligation. To modern audiences, this immediate return to structure feels harsh. There is no recovery period, no emotional processing. But to Romans, this was reassurance. The faster life returned to order, the more successful the marriage appeared. In ancient Rome, marriage was not sealed with romance. It was sealed with routine, and the morning after was not an ending. It was proof that the system still worked. If you thought the wedding night scrutiny ended with the gods and the guests outside the door, ancient Rome has one final surprise for you: the women, specifically the female relatives. And yes, they were paying attention. The morning after the wedding night was not just about rituals and household duties, it was also about verification. Roman society was deeply concerned with legitimacy, inheritance, and ensuring that everyone followed the rules exactly as tradition demanded. To support this obsession, female relatives of the groom often played the role of observers, advisors, and unofficial auditors. These women had seen this ritual before, many times. They knew what was supposed to happen, how it was supposed to look, and what signs indicated that everything had gone correctly. Their presence was not meant to be comforting. It was meant to be thorough. In some households, the bride was discreetly inspected. Not aggressively, not cruelly, but undeniably invasively. This inspection served as confirmation that the marriage had been properly consummated. Romans did not trust private declarations. They trusted physical evidence and witnesses. Romance did not factor into the equation. This might sound shocking, but to Romans it was simply practical. Marriage created legal consequences, property rights, inheritance claims, questions that could destabilize families if left unanswered. Better to be awkward for a moment than to risk chaos later. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to endure this quietly. Complaining would have suggested impropriety. Embarrassment was irrelevant. Dignity was secondary to order. A respectable Roman woman accepted scrutiny as part of her role. The groom's female relatives also offered advice. Unsolicited advice. Advice that was deeply personal and delivered with complete confidence. These women framed their involvement as guidance, not interference. And in Roman culture, elders, especially female elders, were rarely questioned. To modern audiences, this feels intrusive and unnecessary. To Romans, it was reassurance. The marriage had crossed every required threshold. The transition was complete. The system was intact. After this moment, the bride's status changed permanently. She was no longer an outsider. She was now accountable to her husband's family, their traditions, and their expectations. In ancient Rome, privacy was not a right, it was a luxury. And on your wedding night, it was the first thing tradition took away, carefully, publicly, and with witnesses who absolutely remembered everything. After the rituals, the inspections, the shouting relatives, the watchful gods, and the symbolic everything, Roman society finally reached a quiet conclusion. Love was optional, not forbidden, not discouraged, just unnecessary at the beginning. In ancient Rome, marriage was not designed to satisfy emotional needs. It was designed to function. If affection developed over time, that was a pleasant side effect. If it did not, the system continued without concern. Stability mattered more than happiness. Order mattered more than chemistry. This explains why Romans did not panic if a couple seemed distant or awkward after the wedding night. That was normal, expected even. Familiarity would come later, after routines settled in and roles became predictable. Romance was something you earned accidentally, not something you planned for. Roman writers were perfectly comfortable acknowledging this. Love poems existed, of course, but they were rarely directed at spouses. Passion was often described as disruptive, irrational, and socially inconvenient. Marriage was meant to be calm, predictable, boring, in the most respectable way possible. If you wanted excitement, Roman culture provided plenty of alternatives that existed very conveniently outside the marriage contract. This was not hypocrisy in Roman eyes, it was compartmentalization. Marriage handled lineage and legality. Everything else went somewhere else. The wedding night, then, was never meant to spark passion. It was meant to establish a framework, a beginning marked by ritual, not emotion. Once the framework was in place, the couple could decide how to exist within it, politely, dutifully, or with carefully managed affection. To modern viewers, this feels bleak. We are trained to see marriage as the culmination of love. Romans saw it as the starting point of responsibility. Different priorities produce different rituals, and in that context, the strange wedding night makes sense. The noise, the crowd, the symbols, all of it served to drown out uncertainty. Love was unpredictable. Tradition was reliable. In ancient Rome, marriage did not promise happiness. It promised structure. And if love arrived later, quietly, and without ceremony, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. By the time the Roman wedding night finally ended, after the shouting, the singing, the inspections, the gods, the symbols, and the complete lack of personal space, one thing should be very clear. The weirdness was intentional. None of this happened by accident. None of it was random. Every awkward moment served a purpose. To modern eyes, Roman wedding night rituals feel invasive, excessive, and deeply uncomfortable. The lack of privacy alone is enough to make most people physically recoil. But to Romans, privacy was not sacred. Stability was. Order was. Continuity was. And nothing threatened those values more than ambiguity. The rituals existed to eliminate doubt, Doubt about whether the bride had truly left her old household. Doubt about whether the marriage had been completed. Doubt about legitimacy, inheritance, and the future of the family line. Every chant, every torch, every shouted joke worked together to say one thing very clearly. This transition has happened, and it cannot be undone. The wedding night was not about the couple's feelings. It was about society reassuring itself that everything was still in place. The system still worked, the rules still applied, the gods were satisfied, the ancestors were calm, the future was secured. That is why the rituals were public. That is why they were loud. That is why they were uncomfortable. Silence would have invited uncertainty. Privacy would have created room for doubt. And Romans, above all else, feared disorder. In a way, these rituals reveal something deeply honest about Roman culture. They did not pretend marriage was romantic. They did not hide its function behind soft language or idealized stories. Marriage was a tool, a powerful one, and tools needed clear instructions and witnesses. To us, it feels cruel. To them, it felt responsible. And perhaps that is the strangest part. The rituals were not meant to celebrate love. They were meant to protect society from chaos. Romance could come later, quietly, if it wanted to. But tradition always came first, loudly and without apology. So when we look back at ancient Rome and shake our heads at their bizarre wedding nights, we are really seeing a culture that valued certainty over comfort. A world where survival depended on everyone knowing their place and staying in it. In ancient Rome, the wedding night was not a private beginning. It was a public guarantee. And weird, as it turns out, was exactly the point. Margaret of Anjou did not arrive in England as a warrior, a schemer, or a villain. She arrived as a girl of 15, sent across the Channel in 1445, as part of a diplomatic bargain meant to end a long, exhausting war. Her marriage was not romantic, strategic, or even particularly flattering. It was a surrender dressed up as a wedding. England gave up territory in France, received no dowry, and gained a teenage queen whose value, at least on paper, was her obedience. Margaret quickly learned that England was not a place for obedient queens. Her husband, King Henry VI, was gentle, devout, and catastrophically unfit to rule. He preferred prayer to politics and charity to command. At moments of crisis, he simply vanished into himself, slipping into long mental collapses that left the kingdom leaderless. At first, Margaret stayed in the background, doing what was expected of her. She bore insults quietly. She learned the factions at court. She watched men argue over power while her husband stared at the floor. Then England began to crack. Noble families armed themselves. Old grudges resurfaced. The crown weakened, and with it, the fragile peace holding the realm together. The House of York began to challenge royal authority, not openly at first, but with the slow confidence of men who sensed blood in the water. Margaret saw the danger before most did. A queen with no power learns to read rooms very carefully. When Henry collapsed completely in 1453, the illusion ended. The king was alive, but England had no ruler. Margaret, heavily pregnant, was suddenly the only person near the throne who could act. This was the moment that defined her. She did not retreat to prayer. She did not ask politely for protection. She stepped forward. Her son's birth later that year changed everything. Prince Edward was not just an heir. He was proof that the Lancastrian line would continue. Margaret understood what that meant in a country sliding towards civil war. If the crown fell, her son would not be spared. Boys born into disputed thrones rarely died peacefully. From that point on, Margaret stopped pretending she was merely a queen consort. She became a guardian, a strategist, and eventually a commander. England's civil war did not begin because of her, but it would soon revolve around her. By the early 1450s, England was ruled by absence. Henry VI still wore the crown, but his mind drifted far from the business of kingship. During his long mental collapse, he could not speak, could not recognize his own child, and could not govern. Power, as it always does, rushed to fill the vacuum. And this time, it was his wife who stepped into it. Margaret of Anjou was not officially named regent. England was not ready for that. A foreign-born woman ruling outright was too much for the political imagination of the time. Instead, power became informal, negotiated in private chambers and behind closed doors. Margaret attended councils, influenced appointments, and blocked her enemies where she could. Every move she made was criticised. When she spoke, she was accused of arrogance. When she stayed silent, she was accused of plotting. Her greatest threat had a name: Richard of York. He was male, English-born, militarily respected, and dangerously close to the throne by blood. When Henry collapsed, Richard positioned himself as the natural protector of the realm. To Margaret, this was not stewardship. It was a quiet coup. She understood something many men underestimated. Once a rival controls the machinery of government, removing him becomes nearly impossible. What followed was not open war, but a slow, strangling contest. Margaret fought to keep her son recognised as heir. Richard fought to weaken her influence and present himself as England's saviour. Noble families chose sides. Armies began to gather, not yet marching, but ready. This was the prelude to the Wars of the Roses, though few yet grasped how deep the bloodshed would go. Margaret's reputation hardened during this period. Chroniclers portrayed her as domineering, emotional, and dangerous. These were not neutral descriptions. A woman exercising power was, by definition, seen as unnatural. Yet Margaret's actions were brutally logical. She was defending her husband's crown and her son's future in a system designed to strip both away from her. By the time Henry briefly recovered and Richard was sidelined, the damage was already done. Trust was gone. Swords had been drawn, if not yet swung. Margaret had learned the rules of power the hard way, and she was done pretending she did not know how to use them. Once violence became inevitable, subtlety died quickly. The political manoeuvring that had defined Margaret of Anjou's early years in power gave way to something far more dangerous: open war. The simmering rivalry between Lancaster and York finally exploded in 1455 at the First Battle of St Albans. It was short, chaotic, and decisive. Yorkist forces emerged victorious. Royal authority collapsed in public view, and Margaret learned a brutal lesson: mercy would not save her family. The battle left the king once again helpless, and the Yorkists emboldened. Richard of York was reinstated as protector of the realm, a position that placed him closer to the throne than ever before. Margaret was effectively sidelined, pushed away from court, and treated not as queen, but as a threat that needed to be contained. For a woman whose power had always been unofficial, this was dangerous territory. Influence only matters when you can access it. Margaret responded by doing something no English queen consort had done before. She raised her own political faction. Travelling through the north of England, she built alliances with noble families loyal to Lancaster, promising protection, favour, and survival. This was no longer about advising a king. This was about organising resistance. Her court became mobile, her household a command centre. Chroniclers later mocked her for this, calling her reckless and unfeminine. What they meant was effective. By 1460, England was no longer pretending it was at peace. The Wars of the Roses were now unmistakably underway. Margaret's forces clashed repeatedly with Yorkist armies, sometimes winning, sometimes retreating, but always returning. She personally oversaw troop movements, negotiated funding, and coordinated strategy. While she did not fight with a sword, she was present, directing, deciding who lived and who was sacrificed for the cause. Her greatest gamble came when she allowed Parliament to declare Richard of York a traitor. It was a bold, irreversible move. By stripping him of legal legitimacy, she forced the conflict into a fight to the death. There would be no reconciliation now, only victory or extinction. When Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, Margaret stood at the peak of her power. But war rewards no one for long. Each victory sharpened her enemies. Each decision deepened the bloodshed, and the crown she fought to protect was becoming heavier with every fallen body beneath it. The death of Richard of York should have ended the struggle. For Margaret of Anjou, it was meant to be the moment when the war tipped decisively in her favour. The Yorkist claimant lay dead, his ambitions buried with him after the Battle of Wakefield. Margaret had removed her most dangerous rival. But history rarely rewards clean victories. Instead of peace, England received something worse: escalation. Richard's death did not break the Yorkist cause, it hardened it. Leadership passed to his son, Edward of York, young, charismatic, and far more dangerous than his father. Where Richard had relied on legal arguments and precedent, Edward relied on speed, confidence, and battlefield dominance. Margaret had fought one opponent into the ground, only to discover she had unleashed another. In early 1461, Margaret marched south with a Lancastrian army, confident after her recent success. Her forces won a brutal victory at the Second Battle of St Albans, freeing King Henry from Yorkist custody. It should have been a triumph. The king was restored, the enemy was pushed back, London lay ahead, and yet everything unravelled. Margaret made a critical mistake. Her army, drawn largely from the north, had a reputation for looting and violence. London's leaders, fearing what her soldiers might do to the city, closed their gates. Edward of York arrived soon after, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a saviour. The city welcomed him. Within weeks, he was crowned king as Edward IV. Margaret had won battles but lost the narrative. And in civil war, narrative matters almost as much as swords. The decisive blow came shortly after at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest engagements ever fought on English soil. Snow fell so thick it blinded archers. Men fought for hours in freezing mud. When it ended, the Lancastrian army was shattered. Bodies filled rivers. England was exhausted. Margaret fled, first north, then across the sea, carrying her son with her. She was no longer a ruling queen. She was now an exile. Yet even in defeat, Margaret refused to accept finality. Many would have disappeared quietly into obscurity. She did the opposite. From exile, she plotted return, sought allies, and prepared for another attempt. The crown had slipped from her grasp, but the war, she believed, was not yet finished. Exile did not soften Margaret of Anjou. It sharpened her. Forced from England after the catastrophe at Towton, she crossed borders that stripped her of titles but not ambition. With her went her husband, Henry VI, and their young son, Prince Edward, the last fragile symbol of the Lancastrian claim. England was lost for now, but Margaret did not behave like someone defeated. She behaved like someone regrouping. Her years in exile were marked by humiliation and endurance. Courts that once treated her as a queen now saw her as a liability. She moved between Scotland, France, and sympathetic noble households, constantly negotiating for protection and money. The irony was bitter. She had once commanded armies. Now she begged for ships. Yet even here, Margaret proved difficult to erase. She remained politically useful, and she knew it. France became her most important refuge. Though her family connections were strained and her homeland unstable, she leveraged every remaining tie she had. She bargained her future on one thing: her son. Prince Edward was not just her child, he was her weapon. As long as he lived, the Lancastrian cause could not be declared dead. Every negotiation, every plea for support, centred on him. Margaret was no longer fighting for a crown she wore, but for one she hoped her son might claim. Meanwhile, England continued to bleed without her. Edward IV ruled confidently, but his grip was not as secure as it appeared. Old loyalties simmered beneath the surface. Nobles shifted sides. Discontent brewed quietly. Margaret watched all of this from afar, waiting. Exile teaches patience, especially when impatience has already cost you everything. Her chance came unexpectedly. The Earl of Warwick, once Edward's greatest supporter, turned against him in a spectacular political reversal. Suddenly, the impossible became plausible again. Margaret, the exile, found herself negotiating with former enemies. Pride had no place here. Survival required flexibility. She agreed to alliances that would have been unthinkable years earlier, all for the chance to return. In 1471, Margaret's efforts bore fruit. Henry was briefly restored to the throne. For a moment, the world seemed to rewind, but restoration was fragile, and Margaret was no longer on English soil to protect it. This time, fate would move faster than her plans. The restoration of Henry VI in 1471 was fragile from the moment it began. It existed on paper more than in reality, propped up by shifting alliances and exhausted loyalties. Margaret of Anjou, the architect of this unlikely return, was not even present in England when it happened. Delayed by storms at sea, she arrived too late to control events that demanded immediate force, while Henry sat passively on the throne once more. Power lay elsewhere. Edward IV had not accepted defeat. He returned swiftly from exile with experienced troops, money, and momentum. The country that had briefly welcomed Henry's restoration now hesitated. No one wanted another prolonged war. Margaret's return should have unified the Lancastrian cause. Instead, it exposed its weakness. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret was present this time, watching the fate of her family play out on the battlefield. Her army was smaller, less disciplined, and outmanoeuvred. The Yorkists crushed the Lancastrian forces with brutal efficiency. There was no heroic reversal, no last-minute miracle. It was slaughter. The true devastation came after the fighting ended. Margaret's son, Prince Edward, was captured and killed. Whether he died in battle or was executed afterward mattered little. The result was the same. The Lancastrian line was extinguished. The future Margaret had spent decades fighting to protect vanished in a single day. Few moments in medieval politics were so absolute. Shortly after, Henry VI died in captivity in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered. With his death, the war effectively ended. Margaret was captured alive. For the first time in her adult life, there was no cause left to defend, no army to raise, no crown to reclaim. She had lost everything she had fought for. Edward IV showed her mercy of a calculated kind. She was not executed. Instead, she was held prisoner for several years, a living reminder of a war now over. Eventually, she was ransomed back to France. It was not a return home in triumph. It was removal. Margaret left England as she had entered it decades earlier, stripped of power, defined by other people's decisions. But unlike the frightened teenager who first crossed the Channel, this woman carried the weight of a kingdom's collapse on her shoulders. After decades of command, crisis, and relentless motion, Margaret of Anjou entered a phase of life that history records only faintly. This was not because nothing happened, but because nothing dramatic remained to record. Once ransomed back to France, Margaret became something rare for a woman like her, politically irrelevant. For someone who had lived at the centre of war, this quiet was not peace. It was erasure. She returned to a homeland that barely recognised her. France had changed, and so had she. The resources that once supported her ambitions were gone. Her powerful relatives were dead or distracted by their own struggles. Margaret lived in reduced circumstances, dependent on a modest pension and the charity of the French crown. The woman who once negotiated alliances between kingdoms now had no leverage at all. What makes this period striking is not what Margaret did, but what she endured. She had lost her husband, her son, her crown, and her country. Most medieval women disappeared quietly after such losses, absorbed into convents or family households. Margaret did neither. She remained visible enough to be remembered, but powerless enough to be ignored. Chroniclers who once painted her as a monster now barely mentioned her at all. This silence was deliberate. Victors control memory, and the Yorkist regime had no interest in preserving the image of a queen who had nearly destroyed them. Margaret was reframed not as a commander or strategist, but as a cautionary tale, the dangerous foreign woman whose ambition brought ruin. Her years of exile conveniently reinforced that narrative. She was no longer a threat, so she could be simplified. Yet survival itself was a quiet defiance. Margaret lived until 1482, long enough to see England stabilise under a new order, built partly on the ruins she had helped create. She never returned to England. She never saw her son's grave. She never regained a title that mattered. But she also never apologised. There is no evidence that Margaret expressed regret for her actions. No surviving confession. No plea for forgiveness. That absence speaks volumes. She had played the game of power by the same rules as the men around her, and she had paid the same price for losing. The difference was that history punished her ambition more harshly. By the time she died, Margaret of Anjou was no longer feared or hated. She was simply inconvenient to remember. And yet, the wars she fought in reshaped England permanently. Silence could not undo that. Long after her armies were destroyed and her cause extinguished, Margaret of Anjou continued to fight a different kind of war, one she could not win. This battle was over memory, and in that arena she was defenceless. Medieval chroniclers did not struggle to explain civil war. They struggled to explain female power. Margaret solved that problem for them. She was cast as the cause rather than the participant, the spark rather than the fuel. England's decades of instability were folded neatly into her personality. Foreign, emotional, domineering, unnatural. The men who armed the kingdom, betrayed allies, and butchered rivals faded into complexity. Margaret became the villain who made it all happen. This narrative hardened quickly. Writers accused her of cruelty, ambition, and bloodlust, often exaggerating or inventing scenes to make their point. She was described as shouting orders, humiliating enemies, and reveling in executions. These images survived not because they were accurate, but because they were useful. They explained chaos without questioning the system that produced it. What is striking is how selective this moral outrage was. Male nobles who switched sides repeatedly were called pragmatic. Kings who plunged England into war were called unfortunate. A queen who refused to surrender her son's inheritance was called monstrous. Margaret did not behave unusually for a political leader of her time. She behaved unusually for a woman. Later generations inherited these judgments uncritically. Plays and poems reduced her to a caricature, a screaming harridan haunting battlefields and courts. Even centuries later, her name was shorthand for disorder. It was easier to remember her as a warning than to confront the uncomfortable truth that England's civil war was driven by structural failure, not one woman's will. Modern historians have been less forgiving of that simplification. When stripped of myth, Margaret emerges not as a destabilizer, but as a responder to crisis. She acted because no one else would. She fought because surrender meant annihilation. Her mistakes were real, but they were shared by nearly every man who led armies in the same war. History rarely asks whether a woman in power had better options. It asks why she dared to have power at all. Margaret of Anjou became infamous, not because she failed, but because she tried. And in a medieval world that preferred obedient queens, that attempt was unforgivable. When Margaret of Anjou died in 1482, there was no ceremony worthy of a queen who had once commanded armies and bent kingdoms around her will. She passed quietly in France, far from the land that had consumed her life. England barely noticed. And yet, her shadow lingered longer than many crowned kings. Margaret's true legacy is not found in victories or defeats, but in what she represented. She was one of the first queens in English history to exercise power openly and relentlessly during a civil war. Not as a regent in name, not as a symbolic figurehead, but as a decision-maker. She negotiated alliances, raised armies, and made ruthless choices under pressure. That alone placed her outside the boundaries medieval society had drawn for women. The tragedy of Margaret's life is not that she failed, but that success was never a stable option. Every path available to her carried catastrophe. If she remained passive, her husband would be replaced and her son eliminated. If she acted, she became the embodiment of disorder. Power punished her either way. She chose action. The England that emerged after the Wars of the Roses was shaped by the conflict she fought in. Stronger monarchy, reduced noble independence, a deeper fear of civil war. Later rulers learned from the chaos she helped expose. Even the Tudor dynasty, which benefited from the war's aftermath, ruled a country transformed by decades of bloodshed. Margaret did not win the crown for her son, but she helped end an era where weak kings could drift without consequence. In that sense, she was not simply a losing side in history's ledger. She was part of the mechanism that forced change. Civil wars do not have heroes, but they do have catalysts. Margaret was one of them. What remains striking is her refusal to disappear when history demanded it. She did not fade gracefully. She did not retreat into silence when power slipped away. She endured exile, imprisonment, and loss without renouncing her cause. That endurance unsettles traditional narratives more than her battles ever did. Margaret of Anjou is often remembered as a warning. She should be remembered as a case study in survival under impossible conditions. She was not England's downfall. She was a woman who refused to let a broken system quietly destroy her family. And for that defiance, history made her unforgettable, even when it tried not to. The Wars of the Roses did not begin with banners raised or armies marching. They began quietly, inside a kingdom already exhausted. England in the mid-15th century was not stable enough to survive a weak ruler, and unfortunately for everyone involved, that was exactly what it had. At the centre of the collapse stood Henry VI, a man who inherited a crown, but not the temperament to wear it. Henry was gentle, deeply religious, and painfully indecisive. These qualities might have suited a monk. For a medieval king, they were disastrous. England was still reeling from the slow collapse of its territories in France, wars that had drained the treasury and humiliated the nobility. Soldiers returned home unpaid. Merchants suffered from instability. Law and order weakened as powerful lords began enforcing their own version of justice. The king, meanwhile, prayed. As Henry retreated from authority, power began to leak outward. Great noble families filled the vacuum, each convinced that they, not the crown, were the true guardians of England. Rivalries hardened. Private armies grew. Loyalty became conditional. The crown was no longer a symbol of unity, but a prize waiting to be claimed. The most dangerous consequence of Henry's weakness was uncertainty. No one knew who truly ruled. During the king's periods of mental collapse, England effectively had no monarch at all. Councils argued. Regents were appointed and undermined. Every decision sparked resentment. Into this chaos stepped Richard of York, a powerful noble with royal blood and the confidence to use it. He did not declare himself king. He did something more threatening. He presented himself as necessary. What followed was not rebellion, but positioning. Noble families chose sides quietly. Old grudges resurfaced under new justifications. The royal court became a battlefield of whispers and alliances. The symbols of war were already visible before the first sword was drawn. Coats of arms replaced trust. Kinship was weighed against opportunity. England was not yet at war with itself, but it was no longer whole. The monarchy had lost its authority, and once that happened, violence was only a matter of timing. The Wars of the Roses were not caused by ambition alone. They were born from a kingdom that could no longer hold itself together. Once authority fractured, lineage became weaponized. In theory, the English crown followed a clear line of succession. In practice, 15th century genealogy was a mess of overlapping claims, dead heirs, and convenient interpretations. The houses of Lancaster and York were not outsiders fighting the throne. They were family, and that made the conflict far more dangerous. Both sides descended from Edward III, whose many sons had produced too many legitimate claimants for a single crown. The Lancastrian kings ruled through Henry VI, descended from Edward's third son. The Yorkists traced their claim through both the second and fourth sons, which, on paper, gave them a stronger hereditary argument. That fact mattered less than how often it was repeated. In medieval politics, repetition could turn theory into truth. What truly poisoned the situation was that these blood claims existed in a world already flooded with armed men. England's nobility maintained private retinues, loyal not to the crown, but to individual lords. When disputes arose, they were not settled in courtrooms. They were settled with steel. Every legal argument came with a shadow army behind it. The rivalry hardened when Richard of York positioned himself as protector of the realm during Henry's breakdowns. Officially, he claimed to be safeguarding England. Unofficially, he was proving he could run the kingdom better than the king. Each time he governed competently, the idea of replacing Henry felt less radical. Lancastrian supporters saw this as creeping treason. Yorkist supporters saw it as inevitable reform. Neutral nobles watched carefully, waiting to see which side offered survival. Loyalty shifted not based on morality but timing. Choosing too early was dangerous. Choosing too late was fatal. What makes this phase critical is that war was still avoidable. There were negotiations, compromises, and half measures, but none addressed the real issue. England had too many powerful men and no strong centre to restrain them. Every truce simply postponed violence. Every agreement bred suspicion. By the time the first armies gathered, the question was no longer who had the better claim. It was who would strike first. In a system where weakness invited removal, restraint became a liability. Bloodlines provided justification. Swords provided resolution. And England was rapidly running out of reasons not to use them. The moment diplomacy collapsed, violence rushed in to replace it. The first true rupture came in 1455 at the Battle of St Albans, a short, savage clash that shattered any illusion that England's crisis could be solved quietly. What had once been whispered arguments over bloodlines and governance turned into open killing in the streets. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and there would be no clean way out. At St Albans, the forces of Richard of York struck decisively against Lancastrian loyalists. Several of the king's closest allies were killed, not in grand heroic combat, but in close chaotic fighting. The king himself, Henry VI, was captured. That single moment sent a clear message across the realm. The crown could be seized, and the sky would not fall. From then on, restraint became weakness. Noble families scrambled to reassess their positions. Some switched sides immediately. Others armed themselves and waited. The countryside filled with small bands of soldiers wearing household colours rather than royal insignia. England was no longer fighting foreign wars. It was consuming itself. What made this conflict especially brutal was its intimacy. The battles were not distant affairs between strangers. They were fought between cousins, former allies, and neighbours. Noblemen who had shared tables now shared battlefields. Prisoners were rarely spared, because mercy invited revenge later. Executions followed victories with chilling speed. Power changed hands not through law but through survival. The violence also reshaped political behaviour. Parliament became a weapon rather than a forum. Victors used it to legitimise their rule, declare enemies traitors, and confiscate lands. Losing a battle no longer meant temporary disgrace. It meant legal erasure. Titles vanished. Families were destroyed. Estates were redistributed to the loyal. As battles multiplied, England learned a dangerous lesson. Force worked. Each successful coup encouraged the next. Each deposition normalised the idea that kings could be replaced. The crown lost its sacred distance. It became another prize on the field. By the late 1450s, England was trapped in a cycle it could not break. Victory demanded total defeat of the enemy. Compromise became impossible. Politics had failed. Blades now dictated the future. And with every clash, the cost of ending the war grew higher. Civil war has a way of accelerating careers. Men who might have spent decades climbing courtly ladders suddenly found themselves standing on battlefields deciding the fate of England. No one benefited more from this brutal compression of time than Edward IV, the young son of Richard of York. Where his father had moved carefully, Edward moved fast. And in a war defined by momentum, speed mattered. After Richard of York was killed in battle, many expected the Yorkist cause to collapse. Instead, it transformed. Edward was tall, confident, and visibly martial in a way that appealed to exhausted nobles and common soldiers alike. He did not argue genealogy in council chambers. He argued with victories. In early 1461, he marched south, gathering support not through legality, but through presence. Towns opened their gates. Men joined his banner because he looked like a king who could actually win. His coronation as king did not end the war. It intensified it. For the first time, England had two competing monarchies, each claiming legitimacy and each willing to kill to enforce it. Edward's greatest test came at the Battle of Towton, fought in appalling conditions. Snow blinded archers. Mud swallowed the wounded. The scale of death shocked even hardened veterans. When it ended, the Lancastrian army was destroyed, and with it, any immediate challenge to Edward's rule. Towton did not bring peace, it brought dominance. Edward IV ruled decisively, redistributing lands, rewarding loyalty, and crushing resistance. For a time, it worked. The kingdom, exhausted by years of chaos, accepted stability even if it was enforced with fear. England had not healed, but it had paused. Yet the war had changed the rules forever. Edward's rise proved that a crown could be taken and held by force alone. Birth mattered, but battlefield success mattered more. This lesson lingered, unsettling every noble who watched it unfold. If one king could be overthrown, so could another. Beneath the surface of Edward's reign, resentment brewed. Former allies felt sidelined. Old loyalties resurfaced. The war had crowned a victor, but it had not resolved the disease that caused it. England was stable only so long as Edward remained unchallenged, and history had already shown how temporary that could be. Once the crown proved movable, loyalty became negotiable. The middle years of the Wars of the Roses were defined less by ideology than by betrayal. Alliances shifted not because beliefs changed, but because survival demanded flexibility. Nowhere was this more visible than in the rise and fall of the man later known as the Kingmaker. The Earl of Warwick had been instrumental in placing Edward IV on the throne. He commanded armies, negotiated marriages, and projected authority on Edward's behalf. For a time, Warwick was the engine of Yorkist power, but civil war rewards ambition poorly. As Edward grew more confident, he relied less on his former mentor. Decisions were made without Warwick's approval. Honours went elsewhere. Influence slipped. Warwick's response was not loyalty, it was recalculation. In a move that stunned England, Warwick turned against the king he had helped create. He allied with his former enemies, the Lancastrians, proving that in this war, yesterday's traitor could become today's ally. The reversal was not moral, it was strategic. Warwick believed he could control a restored Lancastrian monarchy more easily than an independent Yorkist king. England reeled from the shock. If the most powerful noble in the realm could switch sides, no alliance was safe. Armies marched again. Battles reignited old wounds. Edward was briefly driven into exile. In an extraordinary reversal, Henry VI was restored to the throne, not through strength, but because others moved him there like a political prop. This period exposed the true nature of the conflict. The war was no longer about Lancaster versus York. It was about control. Kings were symbols. Power lay with whoever commanded men, money, and timing. Parliament endorsed whoever stood victorious long enough to summon it. Law followed force, not the other way around. For ordinary people, this chaos was devastating. Lands were seized and reassigned repeatedly. Families were punished for backing the wrong side at the wrong moment. Justice depended on which banner flew overhead that week. The nobility played a lethal game of musical chairs, and England paid the price. By now, betrayal was no longer shocking. It was expected. The only real question left was who would betray whom next, and whether England could survive another reversal. By the early 1470s, the Wars of the Roses had reached a dangerous stage. This was no longer a struggle to claim power. It was a struggle to survive the consequences of having claimed it. The same tactics that had won crowns now tore alliances apart. The war had begun eating the very men who sustained it. The return of Edward IV from exile was swift and brutal. He did not come back cautiously or with half measures. He came back to finish the job. Former allies who hesitated were crushed. Former enemies who surrendered were not always spared. Edward had learned the lesson the war taught best. Mercy extended the conflict. The decisive moment came in a rapid sequence of battles. Warwick, the great kingmaker, was killed in combat, stripped of the power he once wielded so casually. His death marked a turning point. If the man who could make kings could also be destroyed, then no one was untouchable. Power had become lethal even to those who held it longest. The final blow to the Lancastrian cause came shortly afterward. Their last serious army was defeated, and their hope for restoration collapsed in a single afternoon. Henry VI, once king, then prisoner, then king again, vanished from relevance entirely. He died in captivity, almost certainly murdered. His death was not dramatic, it was administrative. The war had learned how to erase people efficiently. What followed was not peace, but exhaustion. England had lost a generation of nobles. Entire family lines had been wiped out. Lands changed hands so often that ownership barely mattered. Authority survived, but trust did not. The monarchy emerged stronger in theory and harsher in practice. Kings would rule decisively now, because indecision had proven fatal. Yet even with Edward restored, the war refused to end cleanly. Too many men had learned that crowns could fall. Too many grudges remained unpaid. The violence slowed, but it did not disappear. It waited. This phase of the conflict revealed its true cost. The Wars of the Roses were no longer about who should rule England. They were about whether England could ever return to stability after teaching itself that power belonged to whoever seized it fastest. The war had solved nothing. It had only changed who survived long enough to write the rules. By the late 1470s, England was quieter, but not healed. The Wars of the Roses had slowed into something more unsettling than open battle: suspicion. Edward IV sat firmly on the throne, yet everyone understood how temporary that security could be. Too many kings had fallen too quickly for confidence to come easily. Edward ruled with greater authority than any monarch since the war began. He rewarded loyalty decisively and crushed dissent before it could grow. Noble independence was curtailed. Private armies were discouraged. The lesson of the war was clear. Strong kings survived. Weak ones vanished. For a time, England accepted this arrangement. Stability, even enforced, was preferable to chaos. But the war had trained England to expect challenges. When Edward died suddenly, the fragile balance snapped again. His heir was a child. Power shifted to regents and protectors. Old instincts returned immediately. The crown once again looked vulnerable, and vulnerability invited ambition. Within months, the boy king disappeared from history, and Richard III took the throne. The justification was legal. The result was familiar. Richard's reign was short, tense, and shadowed by doubt. He ruled competently, but legitimacy haunted him. In a kingdom trained by decades of civil war, perception mattered as much as law. Every rumour carried weight. Every alternative claimant felt plausible simply because replacement had become normal. Into this uncertainty stepped a new figure, Henry Tudor. His claim to the throne was weak, tangled, and laughable on paper. In any other century, it would have gone nowhere. But this was post-war England. Bloodlines mattered less than momentum. Henry promised an end to the cycle. More importantly, he offered exhausted nobles a chance to stop choosing sides every decade. Support gathered slowly, not out of passion, but fatigue. Men who had survived the wars wanted finality. They did not need Henry to be perfect. They needed him to end the killing. As Henry landed in England, the war's final phase took shape. It was no longer Lancaster versus York. It was exhaustion versus uncertainty. England stood at a crossroads, shaped by 30 years of betrayal and bloodshed, waiting to see whether the crown would fall one last time, or finally stay put. By 1485, England had reached the limit of its tolerance for uncertainty. 3 decades of shifting crowns had trained the kingdom to expect collapse, yet desperately crave finality. The last act of the Wars of the Roses would not be long, but it would be decisive. It centred on 2 men who understood exactly what was at stake. On one side stood Richard III, a hardened veteran of civil war. He had grown up surrounded by betrayal and bloodshed and ruled with a clear understanding of how fragile power could be. Richard was not incompetent nor universally hated. He governed firmly, attempted legal reforms, and projected strength. But legitimacy clung to him poorly. Rumours about the disappearance of his nephews followed him everywhere, whether fair or not. In a kingdom shaped by suspicion, doubt was fatal. Opposing him was Henry Tudor, an unlikely challenger whose claim to the throne was weak by dynastic standards. What Henry lacked in pedigree, he compensated for in timing. He positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as an ending. His promise was simple: stop the war end the cycle, marry rival bloodlines, and give England a rest. Their confrontation came at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Unlike earlier clashes, this was not a chaotic sprawl of shifting loyalties. It was focused, tense, and final. Richard fought aggressively, even recklessly, leading a direct charge toward Henry himself. For a moment, it nearly worked. History balanced on a knife's edge. Then, alliances shifted one last time. Key nobles withheld support at the critical moment. Richard was isolated, surrounded, killed on the battlefield. His death was not ceremonial or negotiated. It was abrupt and violent, fitting for a war that had consumed kings without mercy. With Richard's fall, the cycle finally broke. Henry Tudor was crowned as Henry VII, not because he was the strongest claimant, but because he was the last one standing. The crown passed not through purity of blood, but through exhaustion of alternatives. Bosworth did not simply decide a king, it ended a habit. England had spent 30 years learning that rulers could be replaced by force. Now it learned something new, that endless replacement led only to ruin. The battlefield where Richard fell marked the moment England chose closure over chaos, even if that closure came at the point of a sword. When the Wars of the Roses finally ended, England did not celebrate. It exhaled. 30 years of dynastic violence had not produced a clear moral victory, only a profound lesson in what civil war costs. The kingdom that emerged after Bosworth was quieter, but deeply changed, shaped by loss rather than triumph. The most immediate consequence was the destruction of the old nobility. Entire family lines had been wiped out on battlefields, or executed after defeats. Titles vanished. Estates were confiscated and reassigned repeatedly, until loyalty became inseparable from survival. This thinning of the aristocracy weakened the power of great lords permanently. England would never again tolerate a nobility strong enough to challenge the crown so openly. From this devastation rose a new kind of monarchy. Henry VII ruled cautiously, not because he was timid, but because he understood the danger of instability. He avoided unnecessary wars, controlled noble power tightly, and treated rebellion as a disease to be eliminated early. The crown became less theatrical and more administrative. Kingship shifted from personal dominance to institutional control. The war also left a psychological scar. England had learned that kings could be deposed, imprisoned, and killed. The idea of sacred monarchy had been shattered. Future rulers governed with that knowledge always in mind. Authority would be enforced more carefully now, backed by law, finance, and surveillance, rather than personal charisma alone. For ordinary people, the wars had been catastrophic. Crops were destroyed, towns pillaged, and justice distorted by shifting allegiances. The conflict had rarely been about ideology for them. It was about whose soldiers were passing through this year. Peace, when it finally came, was welcomed not as victory, but as relief. Perhaps the most lasting legacy was cultural. The Wars of the Roses became a warning baked into English identity. Writers, chroniclers, and later dramatists treated the period as a descent into madness, where ambition ran unchecked and loyalty meant nothing. It became a story England told itself about what happens when power fractures. The wars ended in 1487, but their consequences echoed for centuries. They reshaped monarchy, destroyed old elites, and taught England to fear internal division more than foreign threats. The country survived, but only by abandoning the illusion that blood alone could guarantee stability. In the end, the Wars of the Roses were not about who deserved the crown. They were about how fragile a kingdom becomes when everyone thinks they do. Medieval queenship did not begin with marriage. It began with spectacle. A woman was not truly a queen until the realm saw her become one. Coronation was the moment when a bride crossed into power, and it was designed to be unforgettable. Bells rang, clergy processed, nobles watched closely, and the queen was transformed in full view of the political elite. This was not decoration, it was authorization. A queen's coronation echoed the king's in structure, though never in scale. She was anointed with holy oil, crowned and seated beside the king, marking her as chosen not only by marriage but by God. The ritual mattered because medieval authority was fragile. Power needed visible reinforcement. Without a coronation, a queen's position was weaker, her influence easier to challenge, and her legitimacy open to doubt. This is why some queens fought fiercely to be crowned quickly. Delay created vulnerability. A crowned queen could issue charters, hold lands in her own right, and act as a legal partner to the king. An uncrowned queen was merely a wife with a title. The difference was enormous. Ceremony translated into leverage. The coronation also taught the queen her role. She processed slowly, dressed in specific colours, surrounded by clergy and noblewomen. Every movement was choreographed. She learned where she could stand, when she could speak, and how she was meant to be seen. Queenship was as much about restraint as authority. Power was permitted only when expressed correctly. Importantly, the ceremony sent a message to the nobility. The queen was now part of the machinery of rule. She could intercede, influence appointments, and serve as a bridge between factions. Ignoring her was no longer polite distance. It was political risk. History offers many examples of queens who understood this instinctively. Eleanor of Aquitaine, crowned twice in her lifetime, used ceremony to reinforce her status in two kingdoms. She did not rely on charm alone. She relied on visibility. Being seen mattered as much as being capable. Medieval politics ran on symbols, and the queen was one of its most carefully managed symbols. Her coronation was the first lesson in that reality. From that day forward, everything she did would be watched, interpreted, and remembered. Queenship was not granted quietly. It was announced loudly, so that no one could later pretend it did not exist. When a medieval king was absent, incapacitated or dead, the crown did not simply pause. Someone had to rule. In those moments, queens stepped into one of the most delicate roles in medieval politics: regency. A regent queen did not replace the king. She preserved him, or more often his heir, until power could safely pass on. Regency was never automatic. It had to be justified, negotiated, and constantly defended. A queen ruling for a child king or an absent husband walked a narrow path. She was expected to govern effectively while pretending she was only holding the seat warm. Too much authority looked like ambition. Too little invited chaos. Every decision carried risk. What made queens suitable for regency was not sentiment, but lineage. A queen was tied to the ruling dynasty by marriage and motherhood. She embodied continuity. Nobles might distrust each other, but they trusted bloodlines. A queen governing in her son's name was seen as protecting the future of the realm, not advancing herself. That distinction mattered enormously. Yet regency was rarely peaceful. Councils formed around the queen, often dominated by powerful men eager to guide or restrain her. Regents were watched closely. Military failures, unpopular taxes, or political unrest were blamed on her judgment. Success, meanwhile, was often credited to advisors. Queens were held responsible without being fully acknowledged. Some regent queens mastered this balance with remarkable skill. Blanche of Castile ruled France during her son's minority with firmness that shocked her critics. She led armies, crushed rebellions, and negotiated alliances, all while insisting she acted solely as a mother defending her child's crown. Her authority was real, but carefully framed. Others faced harsher resistance. Isabella of France, acting against her husband, crossed the invisible line between regency and usurpation. History punished her for it. The difference was not competence, it was perception. Regency revealed a central truth of medieval queenship. Women could rule, but only under specific conditions. They needed the cover of necessity, the language of duty, and the promise that their power was temporary. Queens who respected those rules often governed effectively. Queens who broke them were remembered as dangerous. Behind the pageantry and ceremony, regency was where queenship became unmistakably political. It was here that queens proved they were not passive figures in medieval rule, but essential stabilizers in a system that frequently failed without them. Medieval courts were not just places of ceremony, they were machines for distributing favour, access, and survival. Within them, queens exercised a form of power that was subtle, deniable, and extraordinarily effective. This power flowed through etiquette. Who stood closest? Who spoke first? Who was invited? Who waited? These details were not social trivia. They were political signals. A queen's household was her primary base of influence. Ladies-in-waiting, chaplains, secretaries, and attendants were not chosen randomly. They came from noble families whose loyalty mattered. By selecting who served her, a queen quietly shaped alliances. To place a woman near the queen was to elevate her entire family. To remove her was a warning. No proclamation was needed. Everyone understood. Access to the queen was access to the king. Petitioners who could not reach the monarch often sought the queen instead. Intercession became one of her most powerful tools. A queen could present requests as mercy rather than policy, softening decisions that might otherwise provoke backlash. This made her invaluable and dangerous. She could advance causes without appearing to govern. Etiquette reinforced this influence. Court rituals dictated when the queen appeared, how she was approached, and who was permitted to speak to her directly. These rules created bottlenecks. If the queen chose to delay a meeting or grant it publicly, the message was unmistakable. Favour was being displayed or withdrawn in real time. Queens who understood this system could dominate court politics without issuing a single order. Philippa of Hainaut famously used intercession to temper royal severity, earning loyalty from subjects and nobles alike. Her reputation for mercy was not accidental. It was cultivated, strategic, and politically stabilising. The Queen's Court also functioned as a parallel institution. While the king handled warfare and law, the Queen managed culture, charity, and diplomacy. Visiting envoys observed her household closely. A well-run court signalled stability. A chaotic one suggested weakness. Queens who maintained order enhanced their dynasty's legitimacy. Importantly, etiquette protected queens as well as empowered them. By acting through custom rather than command, they avoided direct confrontation. If challenged, a queen could retreat behind tradition. She was not asserting power. She was following precedent. This ambiguity was deliberate. Medieval queenship thrived in these grey zones. Ceremony, manners, and household routines formed a language of power, understood by everyone at court. Queens fluent in that language could shape outcomes quietly, leaving few fingerprints behind. In a world where overt female authority was suspect, etiquette was not a constraint. It was a shield and a weapon. In medieval Europe, a queen's body was not private. It was political territory. Marriage placed her at the centre of dynastic strategy, and lineage determined whether a kingdom remained stable or slid into crisis. Queens were expected to produce heirs quickly, visibly, and successfully. Failure was not interpreted as misfortune. It was treated as a threat to the realm. A queen's marriage itself was a diplomatic act. She arrived with treaties woven into her dowry, alliances encoded in her ancestry, and expectations written by men she had never met. Once crowned, her primary duty was continuity. An heir secured peace. The absence of one invited rebellion. Every pregnancy was watched. Every miscarriage whispered about. The queen's health became a matter of state. Motherhood did not reduce a queen's political importance. It intensified it. A queen who bore a male heir gained leverage immediately. She became the guardian of the future, a living guarantee that the dynasty would continue. This status protected her influence and, in some cases, allowed her to act decisively in moments of crisis. A childless queen, by contrast, stood on unstable ground. Her value could be questioned. Her position could be replaced. This pressure shaped behaviour at court. Queens cultivated religious devotion publicly, commissioning prayers for fertility and safe childbirth. They distributed alms, patronised saints associated with motherhood, and framed their pregnancies as divine events. These acts were not superstition alone. They were political communication. A fertile queen signalled divine favour. An infertile one raised dangerous doubts. Lineage also gave queens leverage beyond the nursery. Through their children, queens built alliances. Marriages arranged by queens extended influence across borders. A daughter married into a rival house could stabilise decades of tension. A son betrothed strategically could prevent war. Queens were often deeply involved in these negotiations, even when men claimed final authority. Some queens understood this power instinctively. Margaret of Anjou fought relentlessly to protect her son's claim because she knew what his survival meant politically. Her authority flowed from motherhood as much as marriage. To attack her son was to attack the future she represented. In medieval queenship, lineage was currency. The womb was a site of power. And queens who navigated this reality successfully could shape the fate of kingdoms without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Beyond ceremony and motherhood, medieval queenship rested heavily on diplomacy. Queens were not merely decorative companions to kings. They were living bridges between courts. Born into foreign dynasties, raised in multilingual environments, and trained in etiquette from childhood, queens were uniquely suited to manage relationships that kings often complicated with pride or threat. A queen's foreign origin, so often criticized, was actually an advantage. She carried kinship ties that could soften hostilities and open channels unavailable to male rulers. Letters sent in a queen's name carried a different tone. They invoked family, obligation, and shared blood rather than dominance. In an age where insult could spark war, this mattered enormously. Queens frequently hosted envoys, negotiated marriages, and mediated disputes behind closed doors. These were not informal chats. They were structured exchanges governed by ritual, gift-giving, and carefully chosen language. A queen could advance peace without publicly binding the crown. If negotiations failed, the king could deny involvement. If they succeeded, stability followed quietly. This deniability made queens ideal negotiators. The queen's household again played a crucial role. Foreign ambassadors observed it closely, noting order, generosity, and discipline. A queen who ran a calm, dignified court projected legitimacy. Disorder suggested weakness. Queens who understood this curated their image carefully, knowing reputation travelled faster than armies. Some queens became legendary for their diplomatic skill. Eleanor of Aquitaine moved effortlessly between courts, cultures, and political systems, using charm, intelligence, and lineage to influence outcomes across Europe. Her power did not rely on decrees, it relied on presence. People listened to her because she represented continuity between rival worlds. Queens also acted as internal diplomats. They mediated between hostile nobles, soothed offended families, and repaired alliances damaged by royal decisions. When a king needed to retreat without losing face, the queen often provided the excuse. Mercy granted at her request looked humane rather than weak. This diplomatic role required restraint. Queens who spoke too boldly risked accusations of manipulation. Those who remained too quiet lost relevance. Success lay in balance. The most effective queens made others feel heard while steering outcomes subtly in their favour. In a medieval world obsessed with honour, queens operated in the margins where honour bent. They persuaded where kings commanded. They softened where crowns hardened. And while treaties bore male signatures, many of them were shaped first in the queen's chamber, through conversations history rarely recorded, but deeply felt. If coronations granted queens legitimacy, and diplomacy gave them reach, patronage gave them permanence. Medieval queens built power slowly through piety, charity, and cultural sponsorship, arenas where female authority was not only accepted, but expected. This was not soft power in the modern sense. It was structural. Queens were major patrons of religious institutions. They founded monasteries, endowed churches, commissioned altarpieces, and supported clerical careers. These acts signalled devotion, but they also created networks of obligation. A convent funded by the Queen prayed for her family, supported her political interests, and reinforced her reputation as divinely favoured. In a deeply religious society, moral authority translated into political insulation. Piety also protected queens from criticism. A visibly devout queen was harder to accuse of ambition or corruption. Her actions could be framed as service rather than strategy. This did not mean queens were naive. It meant they understood optics. Public prayer, pilgrimages, and almsgiving were carefully staged reminders that the queen stood on the side of God and order. Patronage extended beyond religion. Queens sponsored artists, chroniclers, poets, and scholars. The stories told at court mattered. Chronicles shaped memory. Songs reinforced loyalty. A queen who controlled cultural output influenced how her reign and her dynasty would be remembered. Silence could erase enemies. Praise could elevate allies. Charity was another key tool. Queens distributed food during famines, ransomed captives, and intervened on behalf of the poor. These acts were highly visible and widely reported. They created goodwill beyond the court, anchoring the monarchy to the everyday lives of subjects. When unrest threatened, a beloved queen could calm it more effectively than soldiers. Some queens used this authority decisively. Matilda of Scotland cultivated a reputation for learning and generosity that stabilized her husband's rule and softened opposition. Her moral standing gave her political weight without formal command. Importantly, patronage outlived queens themselves. Foundations continued to pray for them. Endowments carried their names forward. Memory became infrastructure. Even queens who lost political battles often won the long game of remembrance through institutions that survived them. In medieval queenship, power did not always mean issuing orders. Sometimes it meant shaping the moral landscape in which orders were obeyed. Patronage allowed queens to root their authority in faith, culture, and care, forces that endured when armies failed and alliances shifted. Medieval queenship was never tested more severely than during crisis. War, invasion, rebellion, or the collapse of royal authority forced queens into roles far beyond ceremony. In these moments, tradition bent or broke, and queens were judged not by etiquette, but by results. Survival itself became a political act. When kings marched to war or were captured, queens often became the most stable authority left behind. They organized defenses, raised funds, secured loyalty, and maintained order in fracturing realms. This was not theoretical leadership. It involved issuing commands, managing fortifications, and negotiating with hostile forces. The language of queenship shifted from intercession to command, even if chronicles tried to soften it afterward. War also exposed queens to extreme vulnerability. Captured queens were powerful hostages. Their treatment sent messages to allies and enemies alike. A queen imprisoned harshly signalled total victory. A queen treated honourably suggested restraint or negotiation. Either way, her body and status became tools of warfare. Some queens demonstrated remarkable resilience under these pressures. Blanche of Castile governed during open rebellion and foreign invasion, refusing to yield authority even when threatened directly. Her ability to project calm and control prevented fragmentation at moments when the crown could easily have collapsed. Others faced captivity. Queens taken prisoner had to navigate humiliation without surrendering legitimacy. Silence could be dignified. Defiance could be dangerous. Every gesture was calculated. Even in confinement, queens remained symbols. Their survival mattered because it preserved continuity. Killing a queen risked martyrdom and backlash. Crisis also sharpened public scrutiny. Decisions made during war were remembered far longer than years of stability. A queen who failed to act decisively could be blamed for defeat. One who acted forcefully could be accused of overstepping her role. There was no safe path, only necessary ones. What emerges from these moments is the reality that medieval queenship was elastic. It expanded under pressure. Queens who survived crises often emerged with enhanced authority, even if unofficial. Those who did not were rewritten as warnings rather than leaders. In war and captivity, queenship shed its gentler disguises. What remained was endurance, the ability to hold authority together when everything else failed. These moments reveal medieval queens not as passive figures swept along by events, but as anchors in political storms, expected to endure whether history rewarded them or not. For all the influence medieval queens could wield, their power was never secure. Queenship operated within strict boundaries, and crossing them invited backlash. The same visibility that enabled authority also magnified suspicion. A queen who acted too openly risked becoming a problem the political system felt compelled to solve. The limits were informal but absolute. Queens were expected to influence, not command, advise, not rule, persuade, not dominate. When they stayed within these lines, their power was tolerated. When they crossed them, even briefly, the reaction was swift. Chroniclers sharpened their pens. Nobles hardened their resistance. Mistakes that would be forgiven in kings became evidence of moral failure in queens. This backlash was not about competence. It was about discomfort. Medieval politics accepted female power only when it was framed as necessary, temporary, or maternal. A queen acting decisively during crisis might be praised. The same queen acting decisively during stability was accused of ambition. Context determined legitimacy more than outcomes. Visibility made this worse. Queens lived publicly. Their words were repeated. Their gestures were interpreted. Silence could be read as plotting, speech as manipulation. Queens rarely had the luxury of neutrality. Once influential, they were watched constantly, and watchfulness bred resentment. This is why queens often relied on intermediaries. Advisors spoke for them. Councils executed their wishes. Orders were delivered indirectly. Plausible deniability was survival. When something succeeded, it could be attributed to consensus. When it failed, the queen could retreat behind custom. This was not weakness. It was adaptation. Some queens paid heavily when this balance collapsed. Isabella of France crossed from influence into overt political action, and was remembered less for stabilizing a failing realm than for violating expectations. Her effectiveness did not save her reputation. The narrative demanded punishment. Others learned to disappear at the right moment. Retreat could preserve legacy. Withdrawal was sometimes the most powerful move available. Queens who recognized when to step back often survived politically longer than those who pressed their advantage. The price of queenship was constant self-surveillance. Every act required calculation. Power was possible, but never free. The system allowed queens to rule, but only if they accepted that legitimacy could evaporate overnight. Understanding these limits is essential to understanding medieval queenship. Queens were not powerless. They were constrained. And within those constraints, the most successful ones learned when to act, when to vanish, and when to let others believe the decision was never theirs at all. By the end of the Middle Ages, queenship was no longer an anomaly to be explained away. It was a functioning part of how monarchy operated. Queens were not temporary substitutes or decorative figures orbiting real power. They were embedded into the political system itself, expected to stabilize, mediate, and endure where kings often could not. What makes medieval queenship so enduring is that it relied on structure rather than permission. Ceremony legitimized queens. Lineage anchored them. Households empowered them. Custom protected them. Even backlash followed predictable patterns. Queens learned to operate inside this framework, bending it without breaking it. Their authority did not depend on radical change. It depended on mastery of existing rules. This is why queenship survived even as individual queens failed. When one queen fell from favour, another replaced her without dismantling the role itself. The system absorbed conflict. A queen could be disgraced, imprisoned, or sidelined, but the office of queenship remained intact, ready for the next woman to occupy it. That continuity is not accidental. It reflects how essential the role had become. Queens provided stability in a volatile political environment. They linked dynasties across borders. They softened transitions between reigns. They acted as guardians during minorities and anchors during crises. Even queens who never ruled openly shaped outcomes through patronage, intercession, and influence. Their absence would have created gaps the system was not equipped to fill. Importantly, medieval queenship was not a single experience. It varied by kingdom, personality, and circumstance. Some queens ruled boldly. Others ruled quietly. Some thrived in regency. Others dominated through culture or diplomacy. What unified them was not style, but function. Each queen was expected to serve the crown in ways kings could not or would not. This perspective challenges the idea that female power in the Middle Ages was accidental or exceptional. It was expected, regulated, and often relied upon. The system distrusted it, constrained it, and punished it when it strayed too far. But it also depended on it. Medieval queenship was not about breaking the rules, it was about understanding them completely. Queens who survived longest were those who recognized that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it endured through ceremony, silence, and persistence. In that sense, queenship was one of the most resilient political roles of the medieval world. Not because it was free, but because it was necessary.